You don't want to just do well on the LSAT. You want a 175 or above. You want Harvard, Yale, Stanford. You want the number that drops jaws in admissions offices. But here's the thing. You've already done everything you felt you were supposed to do. You've taken courses, read textbooks, gotten tutoring, taken practice tests, and your score is still stuck. It's not an issue of motivation. It's not an issue of intelligence. It's an issue of systems, your LSAT prep system. And the truth is, getting a 175 or above is not about doing more. It's about thinking differently. And that's what I'm going to share with you today. The thing is, most LSAT students never even come close to achieving their fullest potential. And it's not because they're lazy. It's not because they're dumb. It's because their mindset is too casual, and the LSAT punishes casual studying. Here's what that looks like. You do some questions, get a few wrong, you skim an explanation, and then you move on. You assume that more practice equals higher scores. And when it doesn't happen, you panic. Or worse, you plateau and settle. Top scorers, those who get 175 and above, do the exact opposite. They don't kind of prep, they live it. They treat this like it's their Olympic sport, their bar exam, their career hinge point, because it is. Here's the thing. Average scorers try to fit LSAT prep into their life. Gunners reshape their entire life around the LSAT. They schedule study blocks like they're taking classes. They track everything like elite athletes do. They obsess over every nuance, not because they're neurotic, but because they've raised their standards. This mindset changes everything. It moves you from thinking, I hope I do well, to I'm going to control everything I can because this test isn't beating me. One of my students built a color-coded error journal broken down by question type, trap pattern, and emotional trigger. He wasn't naturally organized. He just decided this test wasn't going to outwork him, because you can't kind of hit a 175. You can't half commit. Nobody gets there by accident, so you can't just do a few problem sets and expect total mastery. The LSAT isn't about memorization. It's about precision under pressure, like surgery with a stopwatch running. Obsession works because it forces you to slow down and interrogate the test. Here's how top scorers approach a single missed question. They reread the stimulus 3 times, they rebuild the argument in their own words, they eliminate each wrong answer with a specific reason, they identify the psychological trick LSAC used to lure them into the trap, and they write down what they'll do differently next time that trap shows up. That's 15, maybe 20 minutes of review for a single question, and they do it every single time. If that sounds extreme, good. That's the point, because that level of clarity and feedback is how they calibrate their thinking until it's bulletproof. And this is not about being a gunner for the sake of it. These people have stories. They've been underestimated. They've been told maybe they're not cut out for law school, they're too old, too behind, too late, or that they don't test well. So when they show up to study, it's not just about questions. It's about redemption. They study like their future depends on it, because to them, it does. One student told me, I used to drink to get through finals. I'm sober now. The LSAT is my way of proving I can take back control. That's not motivation, that's identity. Now, you might be wondering, doesn't that level of intensity lead to burnout? It can, but here's what top scorers do differently. They treat studying like training, not as punishment. They don't cram 6 hours a day of random drilling. They rotate between reading, drilling, reviewing, walking, and reflecting. They also set high standards, but they define what enough means. They don't aim for perfection every single day. They aim instead for consistency. Instead of saying, I'll do 100 questions, they say, I'll master 4 questions and understand exactly why I got them wrong. They also know when to pivot. If they're stuck in one section, they don't brute force it. They ask, where is the bottleneck? What pattern am I missing? And do I need new strategies? Burnout doesn't come from effort. It comes from ineffective effort that feels pointless. Gunners, on the other hand, make every single study session meaningful. Now, most students, of course, want a high score, but they're not willing to become the kind of person who earns it. That's what obsession truly is. It's not unhealthy. It's not extra. It's a signal that this test matters enough to you to take full control of it. because you're not studying for a number, you're studying for the discipline and confidence that number represents. And if that's your goal, you're already on the right path. Top scorers don't just grind harder, they engineer every part of their prep. They don't say, I hope I'll improve this month. They say, here's my error log, here's my data, here's where I'm weak, and here's how I'll fix it. That's the difference. So let's break down the system they use step by step. First, they build an error log that actually works, because most students miss questions, check the answer key, then they move on. Some might write a few notes, but almost none of them actually study their thinking. But gunners, they dissect it like a coach breaking down game tape. They create error logs with real structure, not random scribbles. Here's what goes in: the test section and the question number, the type of question like strengthen, flaw, necessary assumption, and so on, why they got it wrong. They'll note what the trap was, what the right answer was, and the pattern it fits into so they can recognize it the next time around. Then you want to master the question types like you're studying for surgery, because you don't get a 175 by solving random questions each day. That's like trying to get fit by doing a different workout every time you go to the gym. Instead, top scorers isolate question types and go deep. Here's how they approach logical reasoning. They don't say, oh, this one's tricky. They say, this is a flaw question based on a causal argument. I've seen this trap before. They ignore a possible third variable. They don't sort of know what strengthen means. They know that strengthen questions require reinforcing the link between premise and conclusion, not just adding information that sounds good. Then they test the answer choices against a model they've internalized, like, does this address the exact logical gap, or does it just sound good? Same deal with reading comp. They don't reread, they pre-frame. Before even reading the passage, they ask, what kind of structure am I likely to see? They track patterns like, does this passage contrast two different viewpoints? Is it heavy on historical development, or is there an unexpected twist or shift in the final paragraph? Top scorers chunk the test into systems. They build muscle memory, and they don't reinvent the wheel every time they sit down. Then they simulate pressure early, not later, because most students avoid full-timed sections until it's almost test day. But that's like training for a marathon and only running a full 26 miles a week before the race. But top scorers, they simulate pressure from day one with timed 35-minute sections, no distractions, no pause button, and full reviews under real constraints. After the timed section, they debrief like professionals. They'll ask themselves questions like, where did I feel rushed? Did I misread because I panicked? Where did I burn too much time? And what patterns of traps am I still falling for? They don't just ask, what did I get wrong? They ask, how did I think during that moment? That's the difference. They aren't just trying to beat the test, they're trying to understand how their brain behaves under stress. They also create weekly feedback loops, and that's where the real magic happens. Gunners don't wait for practice tests to tell them if they're improving. They build weekly feedback loops so they're never guessing. Each week, they review the most frequent question types they missed, the time they spent per section, the average time per missed question, error log patterns, and progress they're making in their drills. They treat their prep like a startup. They don't hope, they measure the data. If you want a 175, that means treating your LSAT prep like it's a six-figure investment, because it is. Now, you also want to eliminate the noise in your life. And it might surprise you, but my best students aren't going on Reddit. Why? Because they already have a prep system of their own, and too much noise dilutes focus. They don't crowdsource their thinking, they refine it. They get feedback from one coach, one curriculum, and one error log. Then they execute relentlessly. If you're still chasing random tips from strangers on the internet with anonymous usernames, ask yourself, am I building a system, or am I collecting random LSAT trivia and hoping it clicks? Now let's talk about the part of LSAT prep nobody really prepares you for. It's not logical reasoning, it's not diagramming flaws, it's the emotional engine behind it all. Because when you're studying for a 175 and above, you're going to want to quit. Not once, not twice, but over and over again. And here's what separates top scorers. They don't keep going because they're motivated. They keep going because the stakes are too personal to ignore. If I ask a 175 scorer, why are you doing this? They never say, I just want to get into a good school. They say, I have something to prove to myself. I want to do this for my family. I need to know I didn't waste the last 4 years, and I refuse to settle. This is identity level stuff. You know how most students fall off after a bad practice test? A 175 scorer doubles down because they're not just chasing a number. They're chasing a version of themselves they haven't met yet, but they believe exists. Pain is the engine, and process is the vehicle. Now, let me be clear. Top scorers are not robots. They get scared, they procrastinate, and they self-sabotage. But they don't stay stuck because the pain of regret is louder than the discomfort of pushing forward. Now, let me show you what this looks like in real life. A student I coached had failed out of college twice. He'd been through addiction recovery, relapsed multiple times, and rebuilt his life from scratch. When he came to me, he said, "This test is how I reclaim my future." He studied every morning before work, then again at night, and he made a 19-point jump from 151 to 170. And that didn't come from some study hack. It came from years of bottled up pain channeled into structured progress. Now, a lot of students will say, I'm trying really hard and I'm doing my best. But high scorers think differently. They ask, am I doing what works? Am I holding myself to the standard I committed to when I said I wanted this? This is the pain no one talks about. Not the fear of failure, but the fear of looking back and realizing that you left points on the table. And if you're really honest with yourself, that fear can become fuel. Now, studying for a top score isn't exciting after week 3. That's when the dopamine wears off. The practice tests start to feel endless and your progress might slow down. Your friends stop bothering to even ask you how your prep is going, and you question if this was all just wishful thinking. But here's what top scorers do that others don't. They make an emotional recommitment every single week. They don't wait to feel motivated. They remind themselves why they started. And some of them might write it on a sticky note, full ride or nothing, or this test does not define me. They also embrace the boredom and routine of studying, and they don't need novelty anymore. They could study parallel reasoning questions for 2 hours straight, and they could drill dense comparative reading passages all night. Why? Because that's where the edge is. They also use the setbacks as part of their strategy. They don't spiral after a bad test. They say, good, that exposed a weakness. Let's patch it up this week. And that level of mental control doesn't happen by accident. It happens when you attach meaning to the process. Now, you can't white-knuckle your way to a 175. Eventually, your brain will rebel. You'll start skipping reviews, you'll procrastinate, and you'll start justifying why a 168 or a 169 is good enough. But that's when 175 plus scorers make their move. They ask themselves, what kind of person am I becoming through this process? They don't wait till test day to act like a top scorer. They act like one now, and the score becomes inevitable. Now, at some point, your prep's gonna break you open, and you'll feel like you've hit your ceiling, and you'll think about quitting. And that's where the 175 scorers are born. Not in the drills, not in the books, but in that moment where it's painful, and they keep going. Because for them, this isn't just a test, it's a total transformation. If you want to understand why some students stall out in the 160s, but others break into the 170s, it all comes down to standards. Not motivation, not how many hours you studied, and not which prep book you used. It's what you're willing to tolerate and what you're not. Now here's what most students never realize. Your plateau isn't caused by your study method, it's caused by your standards slipping without you noticing. You tell yourself, I kind of get this question, or that's probably just a timing issue, or I'll come back and review that one later. But top scorers don't let it slide. They stop, they dig in, and they demand clarity. When they don't understand something, they don't move on, they investigate. They reverse engineer the logic until it's airtight. Because they know, if I tolerate ambiguity now, I'm going to pay for it later on test day. They've felt the pain of losing a scholarship over 2 points. They've seen their dream school go to someone with the same GPA, but a better LSAT score. That's not theoretical, that's real, and they don't forget it. Now, let me show you what this looks like in practice. These are not abstract ideals. These are real behaviors I've seen in top scorers over and over again. First, they define mastery by certainty, not comfort. They don't stop reviewing until they can actually teach the question to someone else. They know why each wrong answer is wrong, not just why the right one is right. For example, they might say something like, C is wrong not because it's irrelevant, but because it strengthens a premise, not the conclusion. That is a classic trap pattern for strengthening questions. This is the level of granularity that we're talking about here. Secondly, they track everything. Score logs, time per section, missed question types, the top 3 most frequent trap patterns, and fluctuations under stress. They don't feel like they're improving. They know where they're trending because they have data. This is not overkill. This is feedback. One student I worked with had a Google Sheet with a tab for every question type and a pivot table showing performance deltas over time. She went from a 164 to a 177 in under 10 weeks. Why? Because she wasn't guessing. She was diagnosing her weak areas. Top scorers also create structure to eliminate excuses entirely. They're not relying on willpower. They automate discipline. They create a foolproof system. For example, it might include 2 hours of review each night after dinner, a full section before they check their phone in the morning, a weekly deep dive day to drill question types, and recurring reminders to take full timed exams. This is what most students get wrong. They treat their prep like a hobby. Top scorers treat it like a job. They build routines that happen whether or not they feel like doing it. Top scorers also set minimum standards for review. When they miss a question, they have a rule. I don't move on until I can explain the trap, the flaw, and how to avoid it next time around. That might take 10 minutes, sometimes 30. They don't care. They know that one deep review session does more than 100 surface level drills. They don't review for closure, they review for transformation. Now let me show you how these standards play out in score improvements. One student came to me scoring 168. He wanted a 175, but couldn't get past 171 on his best day. He was smart, he was focused, but he was totally winging it with his review. He was just reading the answer key and hoping something would click. So we built a structure where he reviewed each question for at least 5 minutes. He would categorize the trap by name and then write out what he should have thought instead of what he did think. 3 weeks later, he was hitting 175s, not because he studied more, but because he refused to tolerate vague understanding anymore. Now let's go one level deeper. High standards aren't just about tactics. They're emotional and they come from a decision. I am done living below my potential. It's the moment where you say, no more half measures, no more saying, next time I'll take it seriously, and no more explaining why I didn't reach my goals. When you hold yourself to that line, something changes. You stop looking for shortcuts. You stop asking if you're doing enough. Instead, you start asking, would this level of prep make me proud 6 months from now? That's how gunners think. So when students ask me, how do I know I'm on track for a 175? My answer is simple. Show me your standards. If your prep is sloppy, your score will be too. If your systems are reactive, your results will be unpredictable. But if your standards are clear and high enough, the score takes care of itself. Now, the final push is where most students fall apart those final 2 to 4 weeks before test day. They've done the work, they've made progress, and suddenly they start second-guessing everything. They'll think to themselves, maybe I should delay, or what if I peak too soon, or what if I peaked already? Should I just switch to another program? Let me be clear. The mental sprint is the final boss of the game, and the students who beat it aren't the ones who study harder. They're the ones who control their psychology under pressure. This final push is the most dangerous stretch in your prep, not because of a gap in understanding, but because of the emotional gaps. You're tired, you've seen every prep test, and your score is bouncing around, and that final jump above 172 might feel just out of reach. Now here's the thing nobody talks about. You've done almost everything right, but not quite enough. And that feeling is brutal because you can feel the finish line. You've tasted the higher scores, but they're not yet consistent. and you're afraid that you're not going to live up to your potential, that you'll get a 169 and be forever explaining why it should have been a 175, and that the next practice test will be worse, not better. This is the wall, and how you handle it determines everything. Let me tell you what top scorers do when they hit this wall. They don't panic, they lock in. They don't chase new methods, they double down on their system. And they don't say, I hope I peak on test day, they engineer the result. And here's how. First, you've got to run those final weeks like a campaign. Top scorers treat the last 3 weeks like a closing argument before the court. Every move is deliberate. Every section is part of a plan. They schedule full-length exams like dress rehearsals. They simulate time of day, pressure, even the environment. And they use a rotating rhythm in their prep. 1 full exam, 1 day of deep review, 2 days of targeted drilling and retesting missed questions, a day of rest or light review, and repeat the cycle. This creates a wave of sharpening. Each cycle gets cleaner, tighter, and more confident. Then they rehearse their emotions. Yes, you heard that right. Most people rehearse questions, but top scorers also rehearse their emotions. They ask themselves, how will I feel if I bomb section 2? What's my plan if I go blank on the first reading comp passage? How do I recover if I go -5 in logical reasoning? And they train themselves to respond before it happens. One student I worked with said, I don't need everything to go perfectly. I just need to be unshakable if and when it doesn't. That is an elite mindset. Not, I hope it goes smoothly, but I know how to get back on track when it's not going smoothly. Then you've got to compress the feedback loop. At this stage, most students are either testing without reviewing or they're over-reviewing and not adjusting. Top scorers compress the cycle. They take a test, they debrief within 3 hours, they create a fix-it drill list that night, then they retest those exact concepts the very next day. They're shrinking the distance between making a mistake and correcting the mistake, because when time is short in those final weeks, you've got to get immediate clarity. Then, in the week before, the day before, you've got to have rituals in place to help build your confidence, because at that point, the margin for error is razor thin. Top scorers engineer confidence. They play the same playlist before every test, they eat the same breakfast, they do the same warm-up drills, they wear the same clothes. Why? Because familiarity breeds certainty. Test day isn't the time to hope you feel sharp. It's the time to feel like this is just another rep. One student ran a 3-question confidence warm-up drill every test morning. Flaw, must be true, and necessary assumption, the 3 of the most common question types. He never skipped this drill. He said to himself, it reminds me I've already won before I even begin the test. And that is not fluff, that is performance psychology. It makes a real difference. You've also got to own the result before you actually get the result. And this might be the most important part. By now, most students are still asking themselves, am I ready? That is a losing frame. Top scorers shift to the mindset of, I have earned the right to execute. They're not hoping to score well, they're expecting to. And that's not out of arrogance, but it's because they built the system that deserves it. Now here's a quote from one of my favorite students. If I don't get the score I want, it's not because I wasn't capable, it's because I didn't execute my system. And if that happens, I already know what to do next. That is called ownership. No blame, no excuses, just clarity and action. Now here's the truth no one wants to admit. Everyone who scores a 175 or above has at least one moment where they think to themselves, I don't know if I can do this. But they keep going. They don't panic. They don't totally overhaul their prep at the last minute. They don't start asking randos on Reddit what to do next. They stay calm, they refine their system, and they execute when it matters. And eventually, they stop being the person trying to score 175 plus, and they become the person who does.